Hello and welcome. I am Professor Rashmi Raman and this is module number 30. In this module, we will be discussing the theory mainly of the process known as transitional justice. Before we begin, I'd like to do a little etymological segue. What is transitional justice? By the name, I'm sure you understand that it means it connotes some kind of transition. But what is the transition here? We are talking about states that are transitioning from a conflict situation into a post-conflict situation. Of course, by default, that post-conflict situation is one of peace. And the whole of the discipline of transitional justice is engaged with inspecting and assessing the different kinds of methods that states use to move out of conflict into a sustainable and maintainable post-conflict peace. Sometimes these are processes of making a new constitution. Sometimes these are processes of telling the truth and reckoning with the past. Sometimes these are processes of obliterating one's national history altogether. And sometimes these are processes of prosecuting and investigating those most responsible for the crimes that took place during the conflict. But in totality, all of these processes have a unity at their core. That unity is the desire of the state to move out of the conflict situation into some kind of a future which is post-conflict. And that is why the second part of the word, justice, has been very deliberately used to understand the discipline. Transitional justice therefore now connotes the methods and the processes by which states that have fallen into conflict move out of it. And the connotation is that they move out of it into something better. After the introduction, we will discuss the 4 processes of transitional justice. We will then discuss the assumptions and goals of this module. We will follow it up with practical examples, bring in a discussion on the gender dimensions of transitional justice, and then draw our conclusions. To learn the concept of transitional justice, to understand its theory, to understand the process that forms the theory of transitional justice is the main aim of this module. The secondary aim of this module is to understand the aspect of gender sensitization within the realm of the broader discipline of transitional justice. Transitional justice, as I have explained to you in the beginning, are the judicial and extrajudicial methods, measures and processes implemented by different states in order to redress the different mass atrocities that have taken place on their territories, resulting in violations of human rights. Examples of measures under transitional justice include criminal prosecutions, truth and reconciliation commissions, reparations programs, institutional reforms, and various other kinds of reforms. However, these are not exclusive. This list is not exhaustive. Measures that result in the reformation of a society in such a manner that the society can be assured that these human rights violations do not repeat is the main process and the aim of transitional justice. An important distinction needs to be made here between the discipline of transitional justice and the aim of transitional justice. Whereas the discipline believes that there is no one formula which fits all contexts when it comes to fulfilling the various obligations that a state is required to fulfill in order to move on from peace, the specific aspects of transitional justice fall under administrative law. This also connotes that transitional justice is more a philosophy than a method of law. And in fact, the various sub-processes become topics of municipal law. If you look at some of the seminal texts in the discipline, The texts tell us that transitional justice is constituted along 4 axes. Each of these axes stands for a process. These processes add value to the municipal administrative law that takes it on forward. The first aspect of the process is prosecution. Prosecution is identifying those most responsible for the mass violations of human rights and finding out ways under municipal law, hybrid law, or international law in which they can be punished for crimes. The second axis is the axis of reparation, which ensures that a redressal exists for the victims of atrocities for all the violations of human rights that they have been through. The third axis is the truth-seeking process. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or the Truth-Telling Commission, is tasked with carrying out investigations regarding the atrocities that took place. And finally, the fourth axis is the axis of institutional reform, which is a process to somehow ensure that these occurrences do not repeat. The 4 processes share a unity of purpose, that is, to deal with history and to take ownership of one's own national history, no matter how traumatic. Apart from these core processes, there are some other aspects of transitional justice. These might include consultations, the process of disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration of populations. Let us discuss each of these axes one by one. I'd like to start with the first one, which is the prosecution or the justice process. Important beliefs on the basis of which the entire system of transitional justice are founded is that atrocities are not wreaked by states. They are authored by individuals, and therefore the prosecution of individual perpetrators in crimes against humanity, genocide, and war crimes results in the kind of justice that societies need in order to move forward. The major sources of this kind of transitional justice are in the codified rules that exist in human rights treaties, such as the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the European Convention on Human Rights, and more importantly these days, the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. I understand as I say this that many of you are thinking about Module 21, in which we spoke about the lack of democratic consensus building in the Rome Statute. You are right, the Rome Statute does not apply to all states, but it is still an important source of codified law from which the justice process of transitional justice comes. The second axis is the redressal axis. How does one offer reparations to victims who have suffered mass violations of human rights, such as genocides and war crimes? International law is founded upon an established principle that reparations should always be proportional to the harm that is committed. This rule of proportionality is supported by municipal practice. However, it's very hard to quantify the value of life, and therefore, historically, courts have desisted from awarding damages for mass violations of human rights. To give you an example of what might happen if a court decided to quantify the value of a human life, it would mean that they would settle the value of a human life at X. And if a state were able to afford, say, 1 billion times X, that state would then have the economic means to commit genocide and be legally permitted to commit genocide so long as it was allowed to pay reparations to the tune of X times N. Now, this absurd conclusion is not supported by logic, and that is the main reason that reparations are not encouraged in the area of human rights. The third axis of transitional justice is Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. Now, this is historically a very important act. The act of bringing the perpetrator and the victim in the same room, in the same forum, before communities and before elders, in order for one to state to the other a full statement of the crime that they have done, has been shown to be a very powerful tool of reconciliation. The idea is that truth telling the truth leads to reconciliation. This has not been practically possible to implement in all societies, but one society which was able to implement this with tremendous success was South Africa. Under the leadership of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, at the end of the 1993-94 apartheid wars, South Africa institutionalized what was known as the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The job of the commission was to bring together powerful community elders in large community spaces such as a school classroom or a gymnasium. And in that space, on Sunday mornings, instead of attending mass at church, victims and perpetrators came face to face and told the truth about the incidents of a given day. This was not admissible as evidence in a criminal sense, but resulted in the finding of reconciliation. The final aspect of transitional justice is to tell the truth about the past in order to deal with history. This aspect has been very important. Let me give you an example to illustrate this. The Armenian genocide, which took place 115 years ago, is not documented. There is no documentation and no evidence to tell us how many lives were lost, who were the victims, who were the perpetrators, where is the evidence. What is the reason for the loss of this documentation? It was a process known as historic revisionism. The Ottoman Empire chose to ignore the Armenian genocide and in fact created documents that made it seem as if no genocide had taken place. Because of historic revisionism, there has been nothing to document the genocide against the Armenians, and therefore the Armenians have not had an opportunity to deal with their history. To avoid this, the central goal of transitional justice is to deal and reckon with one's own history, no matter how problematic. The Rwandan President Paul Kagame very powerfully published a statement about the objective of the Rwandan presidency. He wanted to make it very clear to future generations of Rwandans that there was no moving on without having dealt with the past. And it is in this kind of idea that the seed for a peaceful future lies in dealing with the past, that the idea of transitional justice is rooted. Let us now take some case examples to tell you stories of transitional justice from different places in the world. One of the stories I'd like to tell you is the story of Sierra Leone. The period of transitional justice came in Sierra Leone after a period of 11 years of war. You have studied Sierra Leone in the context of the Special Court. In module 12 or 13, when you were studying the Special Court for Sierra Leone, you were told that a Truth and Reconciliation Commission was set up in parallel to the Special Court for Sierra Leone. Now this gives you a sense of how the processes of transitional justice are not mutually exclusive. Prosecutions as well as truth and reconciliation can happen and do happen side by side. The second example that I'd like to take is the example of Liberia. Gross violations of human rights on a mass scale took place in Liberia between January 1979 and up until October 2003. The website of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for Liberia lays down a variety of objectives with which it was instituted. The first of these, and the most interesting for our purposes, is that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission decided to address the situation of repression at hand. This is an example of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission going one step ahead of the state in the fight for justice. The third example is Kenya. Kenya had established a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the year 2009. This Truth and Reconciliation Commission was empowered to look into all the past abuses that Kenya had faced since its independence in 1963. However, this Truth and Reconciliation Commission never submitted a report. and this is a limitation of the mechanism. Sri Lanka is the fourth example, where a transitional justice mechanism is yet being put into play. Sri Lanka even today is considering establishing, in addition to a permanent international war crimes tribunal, a parallel process of soft justice meted out by community elders. This in fact mimics the system that I have explained to you for Rwanda. In Rwanda, truth and reconciliation happen through a process known as Gacaca. The word Gacaca in the language Kinyarwanda means under the tree, and this was formed by a village council of elders who would sit under a tree, listening to cases which were brought before them in the ancient form that was practiced in Rwanda. It is quite similar to the panchayati system that exists in India, just to give you a parallel. The last example that I gave you was the example from the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. As I explained to you before, the Rwandan process of transitional justice was a combination of the Gacaca courts as well as the ICTR. But let us not forget the national prosecutions that were happening alongside. So in fact, there are three processes that contributed to transitional justice in Rwanda. One, the Gacaca courts. Two, the national prosecutions. And three, the international prosecutions. And this is the most important thing that you must know about this discipline. Transitional justice is an umbrella term. It includes the elements that are subsumed and supervened by municipal law. It is not just an application of international criminal law to a conflict situation. And this is the main reason that one case of transitional justice is completely unique from another case. And that is why the rule of precedent or stare decisis does not apply in transitional justice. To give you a quick illustration of how this could go horribly wrong, let's take the case of Nepal. Nepal has just emerged after the election of Prachanda from a long period of communism. In that period, there have been over 200,000 undocumented killings. Those undocumented killings were presented before the Human Rights Committee. The Human Rights Committee constituted a special task force under the leadership of a special rapporteur for Nepal in the year 2006. The rapporteur submitted his report in 2010 and advocated the creation of a truth commission for Nepal. Having advocated this, the rapporteur left it to the national government to implement the Truth Commission. However, the Truth Commission that was eventually set up was under the leadership of the same national government that was accused of having committed the crimes. You can see here how entrusting the process to a national government does not always result in an equitable or justiciable result. It is possible to tamper with the product. And that is why the International Commission of Experts, constituted under the International Commission of Jurists, that is the other ICJ, have set up a white paper on transitional justice. This white paper gives you 3 guidelines for setting up transitional justice mechanisms. 1, that the conflict that took place in the state must have ended before a process can be instituted. And this is what rules out examples like Sri Lanka and Nepal, where the conflict is still ongoing and cannot be said to have ended. 2, that the arbiters of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission cannot be the same people who are part of the government in power or the government that was just in power. And 3, and most importantly, that transitional justice cannot be represented only by prosecutions or by truth commissions. It must be a combination of judicial and non-judicial means, which means that the former Republic of Yugoslavia, which was represented in conflict only by the ICTY, would not be a good example of transitional justice, because here you have only a judicial process. In this part of the lecture, I'd like to take some time to talk to you about the gender sensitization aspect of transitional justice. a lot of progress has been observed in the efforts to protect women's rights under international law, especially after the jurisprudence that has come out of the former ICTR and ICTY. These two tribunals created some of the most path-breaking jurisprudence for women's rights. The main case that I'd like to talk to you about is a case that we spoke about in Module 2. That is the case of Jean-Paul Akayesu. In order to evaluate the gender sensitivity aspect of transitional justice mechanisms, it is important to understand the fact that women's experiences during periods of repression and mass atrocities of human rights are not only limited to sexual violence alone, but also subsume the entire plethora of other human rights violations, including gender aims in regular punishment of offenders, respecting and reviewing the condition of imprisonment of victims, all of which help in improving the plight of women. The sad reality about the state of gender equality is that international criminal law does not make a clear distinction between the object of a crime, which means that the object of a crime is usually restricted to a civilian or a non-civilian object. The special atrocity and the special suffering that women go through at camps for forced rape, forced pregnancies, forced termination of pregnancies, forced deportment of population, the special kind of torture that is reserved in chambers for women, are not legislated against in subsequent laws which are used to set up tribunals to try those most responsible for these crimes. An exception to this is the International Criminal Court, which transcended decades of jurisprudence of the ICTR and the ICTY in coming up with a path-breaking system called a support unit for victims and witnesses, in which a special cell was created for victims of sexual violence. And in each cell, there was a sensitization officer, a staff of the United Nations, who had served in the major conflict zones that represented that case. In the Akayesu decision, the bench of the ICTR, comprising Judge Navanethan Pillai, ruled that rape could be a war crime, thus enlarging the definition and the chapeau requirements under the definition of rape in the Rome Statute. This definition of rape as a war crime has been adopted by many municipal courts since. What transitional justice can do to take the learning from Akayesu and put it in a consistent normative foundation in order to create a base for subsequent jurisprudence on violence against women is to create a special case of violence against women as a punishable offense in and of itself. This has only been done in one tribunal, that is the Special Tribunal for Sierra Leone, which we just spoke about. Political forces and armed forces become united in their purpose against women. This was observed in Darfur, where under the reign of Omar al-Bashir, one area of Darfur was reserved for violence against women by men on horseback, known as Janjaweed. Subsequent reports also showed us that UN peacekeeping forces joined the Janjaweed in the atrocities that they committed against women. So the idea that women are an especially vulnerable group during conflict should be treated as a given before these tribunals. And only after that, the cases of transitional justice can be properly documented as case studies so that they serve as evidence that can then be used before an international criminal tribunal or a municipal court. The problem, of course, is that all of this is ideological. Municipal law does not make a distinction based on gender in respect of crime. And the rule for this is the rule of residual reasoning. Now, the rule of residual reasoning prohibits the creation of binaries, either of gender or of caste or of ethnicity, in violent crimes which are addressed by criminal law. One must respect the rule of residual reasoning, and one must understand that creating a binary only results in a bifurcation of jurisprudence. That is not the purpose that transitional justice serves. The only way that transitional justice can harmonize with international criminal law is if it serves the violence against women in a non-judicial manner. It is yet to be done in a creative manner by any tribunal, and so I invite you to look into cases of atrocities that are ongoing and propose creative remedies that can take into account the gender binary, which is a reality of conflict but is sadly ignored by legislature. Thank you.